The heat in the western plains could crush a man's spirit before noon. Dust rose from the ground in slow spirals, catching the light like smoke from an invisible fire. In the middle of that cracked earth sat an 18-year-old boy, thin as a fence rail, his skin marked by bruises that weren't fresh enough to shock anyone here. They'd had time to fade to the sick yellow of old hurt, but his eyes, those still burned, like embers refusing to die. His name was Finn Holloway, and in this yard he was not a person. He was something to be measured, gossiped about, discarded. The murmurs swirled as thick as the dust. A merchant shook his head and muttered, "Look at the way he holds himself. Not like a man." A rancher spat into the dirt, calling him a queer stray and not worth the feat it would take to keep him alive. Another laughed and suggested leaving him for the vultures. Finn didn't move. He didn't look up. He knew too well what came when you reacted mockery, worse than the words themselves. The auctioneer's voice lacked the rhythm he used for good cattle or fine horses. This was half-hearted, an afterthought. People shifted under the sun, waiting for something worth their attention. Then the crowd split. A tall figure stepped forward, boots thudding against the packed dirt. A cowboy, broad-shouldered but worn by miles of trail. His shirt was faded, his hat pulled low against the sun. His name was Jeremiah, and unlike the others, he didn't circle Finn like a man assessing livestock. He stopped a few steps away, studying him, not the bruises, not the way he sat, but his face, as if searching for something only he could see. The auctioneer started to list a price, but Jeremiah's voice cut through, steady and final. "I'll take him." No number, no bargaining, no hesitation. Just those words, in a stillness that followed like the pause before a summer storm. A few snorted in disbelief. "Not worth the trouble," someone muttered. Jeremiah didn't answer them. He stepped forward, offering a hand that wasn't rough or pitying. It was simply there, waiting. For a moment, Finn didn't move. Then, as if pulled by something deeper than instinct, he stood. He brushed the dust from his knees, lifted his chin, and met Jeremiah's gaze. It was the first time in months he'd been looked at without judgment, in the eyes staring back. They walked away from the yard without a backward glance. The sun was still merciless. The dust still stung the skin, but Finn's chest felt different, lighter, like a weight had been shifted just enough to take a breath. In the space of a few minutes, he had gone from being the queer boy nobody wanted to someone worth taking out of that place. What Finn didn't know yet was that this day would become the first crack in the wall the world had built around him. The day someone refused to see him as shame. The day a stranger who owed him nothing chose to stand in the open and claim him, without apology. Sometimes rescue doesn't arrive in a blaze of glory. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a voice that says, "I'll take you," when everyone else says, "Leave him." That's when you learn the smallest decisions can change the whole direction of a life. If you want more stories like this about people who refuse to bow to the world's cruelty, stay with Hard Stories. Because what happened after this moment would test loyalty, identity, and the kind of courage that doesn't fit in anyone's neat definition of a man. The wagon rolled west along the dirt track, its wheels groaning against the ruts carved deep by years of travel. The air still carried the weight of the auction yard. But between Finn and Jeremiah there were no questions, no probing stares, just the sound of hooves and the creak of leather. Their language, in those first hours, was built from quiet gestures. Jeremiah slid a tin plate toward Finn before taking his own. He shifted the canvas to cast more shade where Finn sat slouched against the side rail. When they stopped for the night, a worn pair of boots appeared beside Finn's bedroll, a size too big. The soles weathered but intact. Finn had not felt that kind of wordless consideration in years. He studied Jeremiah's movements, careful but never hesitant, as though he'd long learned how to protect without drawing attention to the act. Eventually, though, curiosity pressed through Finn's guarded silence. The question slipped out in a low voice. Why me? Jeremiah didn't turn from the small fire he was coaxing to life. His answer was steady, almost like he'd known it for years. "You remind me of someone who didn't fit the mold they were forced into." It wasn't pity, And it wasn't a riddle. It was a truth offered without demand. By the time they reached Dry Creek, whispers had already outrun them. Faces turned as they passed, some only curious, others curling with that familiar sneer. The saloon steps were lined with men who knew how to use words like knives. One of them spat tobacco into the dust and said loud enough for half the street to hear, "That's the queer boy they touched from Dust Hollow. Guess he's got himself a keeper now." Laughter followed, bitter and hollow. Finn felt his shoulders tense, instinct urging him to shrink. But before the weight of those stares could settle, Jeremiah slowed his stride. Without a word, he moved half a step closer, putting his solid frame between Finn and the men leaning on the railing. His presence was an unspoken wall, one that didn't answer insult with insult, but didn't yield an inch either. The hecklers quieted, their laughter thinning into mutters. Inside the small mercantile, the shopkeeper's eyes flickered between them, lingering too long on Finn's face. Jeremiah's voice stayed even when he asked for supplies, but his hand brushed Finn's shoulder in a silent signal. "You are not alone here." That subtle defiance was more powerful than any sharp reply could have been. That night, Finn lay awake under the weight of something unfamiliar. It wasn't safety, he wasn't ready to believe in that yet. It was the realization that Jeremiah's rescue wasn't a single act in a dusty yard. It was ongoing, woven into every quiet choice. Every moment he refused to let someone else define Finn by the worst words they could find. In a world that measured worth by conformity, Jeremiah's calm defiance planted a question in Finn's mind. If someone could see past the label everyone else used to break him, maybe that label didn't hold the power it once did. And maybe, in time, he could see himself without it. The morning broke hard and fast, the kind of pale light that seemed to sharpen every shadow. Finn had barely finished tightening the saddle straps when Jeremiah's head snapped toward the ridge. The faint metallic jingle of spurs carried on the wind, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses moving with purpose. Deputies. Their silhouettes appeared against the rise's broad hats, rifles slung low, dust trailing behind them like a warning. Jeremiah didn't waste a breath on explanation. "Ride," he said, and they were off. Hooves hammering through the dry grass, cutting between jagged stones that clawed at the sky. The deputies closed in, voices barking orders to stop. Finn's pulse pounded so loud he barely heard the first shot crack against the rocks ahead. They veered sharply toward a gash in the hillside of mine, long abandoned, its entrance yawning like the mouth of some ancient beast. Inside, the air cooled and thickened with the scent of rust and damp earth. The deputies' shouts echoed, but their footsteps didn't follow. For a moment, there was only their breathing and the slow drip of water from somewhere deep within. Then, from the darkness outside, came a voice measured, deliberate, meant to carry. Finn Holloway. The name struck like a stone to the chest. Finn froze. It had been years since anyone in authority had said his full name without spitting it like a curse. The voice went on, listing accusations that twisted the truth until it snapped. He was wanted for disrupting the peace in Dust Hollow, for false claims against respected townsmen. Jeremiah's eyes never left him. "Crow," he said quietly, and the name landed heavy between them. In the dim light filtering through the mine's mouth, Jeremiah explained Crow was protecting his own men, the same ones who had beaten a boy in the back alley because they thought his existence was an offense. Finn had fought back, not with fists, but with truth. He'd spoken of what they'd done, and that made him dangerous. And being gay, in Crow's eyes, only made it easier to paint him as unstable, dishonest, unworthy of belief. By the time they reached the creek that wound like silver through the valley, Finn's chest felt tight with something heavier than fear. He knelt by the water, its cold bite grounding him, and spoke without looking up. "I thought no one would ever stand beside a queer man against the world's lies." His voice was quiet, but the words felt like peeling away an old bandage. Jeremiah crouched beside him, filling a canteen. "You're not just that," he said, steady as the current. "You're a man who's still standing." The truth in that sentence settled deep, past the layers of shame and caution Finn had worn for years. It didn't erase what had been done, but it shifted the weight just enough to imagine living differently, not as someone constantly ducking the world's blows, but as someone who might one day meet them head-on. Some wounds don't close by pretending they were never there. They begin to heal when someone sees them without flinching, when they remind you that you are more than the reason you were hurt. And sometimes that reminder is enough to keep you moving toward the next day. The sun leaned low over Dust Hollow, throwing long shadows across the open square. Word had spread quickly that Crow was looking for Finn, and now the air was thick with the kind of anticipation that comes before a public reckoning. People lined the edges of the street, faces half hidden beneath hats, their whispers sharp enough to cut. Finn stood at the edge of the crowd, Jeremiah just a step behind, the heat of his presence steady against the mounting chill that wasn't from the weather. Crow emerged from the sheriff's office, his boots striking the wooden boards like a drumbeat, his eyes locked on Finn with a mix of satisfaction and contempt. "There you are," he drawled, the corners of his mouth curling. "Thought you could run, thought you could smear decent men and hide behind someone else's coat." He stepped closer, letting his voice carry, "You think a real man would protect you? You're nothing but a waste, an embarrassment to the Holloway name." Jeremiah moved forward before Finn could speak, planting himself between Crow and the boy he'd taken from the auction yard. His voice was calm, but it reached every ear in the square. "Finn is my family. And if you want the truth, I'm gay too. So if you're going to drag someone off for being who they are, you'd better take me right alongside him." The statement hit like a thunderclap. The crowd stilled, a ripple of disbelief passing through them. The men who had been smirking now shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. Crow's jaw tightened, his swagger faltering for the first time. He opened his mouth to retort, but another voice cut through the sound of authority unshaken. Delaney and Riggs, the county marshals, pushed through the gathering, their badges catching the light. "That's enough," Delaney barked. "We've got sworn statements, witnesses, and more than enough to bring you in." "Crow." Riggs moved behind him, binding his wrists while the crowd parted like water. Crow tried to twist, to bark out protests. But the weight of the moment had already shifted. Finn watched in stunned silence as the man who had hunted him was led away in irons. It wasn't just the arrest, it was the fact that Jeremiah had stood in the open, under the same sun that had burned Finn at the auction yard, and declared his own truth without a flicker of shame. In that moment, the fear that had trailed Finn for years seemed to loosen its grip. He wasn't invisible anymore, and he wasn't alone. There's a power in claiming someone openly, in saying to the world, "This person matters to me," even when the world wants you to be silent. And there's a greater power still in refusing to let fear dictate who you stand beside. That day in Dust Hollow, Jeremiah taught more than loyalty. He showed that living honestly is a form of defense no one can strip from you, no matter how loud the jeers or how deep the prejudice. Dust Hollow had a way of keeping its ghost close, even after Crow was taken away. The town carried the echo of all that had been done and all that had been ignored. Finn returned with Jeremiah not to claim victory, but to close a chapter that had been forced open for far too long. The streets felt smaller than he remembered, the buildings more weathered. Yet every face seemed to search him for traces of the boy they'd once branded queer and sold off like a mule, too stubborn to break. In the corner of the old general store, Ruth, her hair now silvered, her eyes still sharp, stopped mid-step when she saw him. Her hand trembled as it reached for the counter, the air between them suddenly heavy with something unspoken. "It is you," she whispered. "The boy they sent away. I never thought I'd see you stand in this town again." From beneath the counter, she pulled a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a folded letter, edges worn from years of being opened and closed. The handwriting was unmistakably careful, the kind that came from someone not used to writing, but desperate to be understood. "If you find him, tell him I never blamed him. Tell him I've been looking all this time." Finn's chest tightened as he read the words, confusion and recognition colliding. He looked up, and Jeremiah's gaze was fixed on him, not with the guarded patience he often wore, but with something raw. "Finn," Jeremiah said quietly, "there's something I never told you." He removed his hat, the gesture almost reverent. "My name isn't just Jeremiah, it's Jeremiah Holloway. And you're my brother." The world seemed to still, the sounds of the town dimming to a low hum. Pieces of memory Finn had buried began to align the familiarity in Jeremiah's eyes. The way he looked at him in the auction yard, not as a stranger, but as someone finding what they'd thought was lost forever. They didn't celebrate. There was no dramatic embrace, just the steady understanding that blood had found its way back to blood. From that day forward, the Holloway Ranch changed. It became more than a working spread. It became a refuge. The barn lofts and spare rooms filled with the young people who had been pushed out of their homes for being gay, for being different, for refusing to fold themselves into shapes that made others comfortable. There was work to do, fences to mend, fields to tend, but there was also safety, and the kind of quiet respect that Jeremiah had once shown Finn on that long ride from the auction yard. Years later, after Jeremiah passed, Finn found himself tending the same dusty yard they had once crossed together. In the crown of an old felt hat, Jeremiah's hat, he discovered a photograph. Two boys, barefoot by the river, faces sunlit and unguarded. Scrawled on the back were the words, "Finn, you were always mine to keep." Standing there, hat in hand, Finn realized that the journey had not been from unwanted to wanted. It had been from unseen to truly seen. And once you've been seen, you can make space for others to step out of the shadows. What about you? Do you believe family is only about blood? Or can it be built from those who choose you? Share your thoughts. And stay with Heart Stories for more stories that remind us why we fight to be ourselves and for each other.